Good morning and welcome to the 109th Learn with Lorna, where we'll be looking at the subject of Dounreay and the atomics. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres: the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Skye and Lochailsh Archive Centre in Portree, and Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that, and there's a link to be able to do so in the chat. This week I'm carrying on with the theme On the Move, looking this time at the period, a period of great influx of people to Caithness in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Again, if you have any memories of this period, which I'm sure people will do, please share. As I said last week, this one is pre-recorded because I'm on leave, but as always, please do comment. Either one of my colleagues or I will pick up on them a wee bit later. The story we're talking about today, as I say, looks at the story of Dounreay, the nuclear energy industry, and obviously this is a collection that comes from Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness archives. And thank you to my colleague Valerie in Nucleus for her help in pulling this one together. In 1954, Dounreay, which is on the very north coast of the UK in Caithness, was chosen as the site for a new type of nuclear reactor. This new project was designed to assess the effectiveness of fast breeder reactors in generating power for electricity. I'm not going to pretend to be a huge expert in nuclear power, but what I will say is that this was a brand new project designed to test a new system. In order to do this, there was a requirement for a large workforce in what was a very sparsely populated area at that time. And Caithness, as I've said on numerous different occasions, Caithness for centuries has been largely reliant on fishing and farming. And in the 1950s, both of these worlds were becoming more mechanised, and therefore it was becoming a bit harder to find work in those areas. And so a new industry in the area was really a big coup, giving work to locals, but also bringing in new residents who would come under the term used by the writer Stephen Cashmore. The atomics is what the new and local workers at this new site would be termed. Now, the nearest town to the planned site was Thurso, 9 miles along the coast. And in 1951, Thurso's population was around 3,200. Within 8 years, this had tripled with purpose-built housing and facilities. So you can see what a huge impact this had on the area. Now, Thurso Borough Council were great supporters of the project right from the outset. They worked closely with the UK Atomic Energy Authority to deliver the housing and the associated infrastructure on a very tight timescale. The houses that were built specifically for the workers at Dounreay were modern and attractive and reasonably priced to rent. And that really acted as a lure to bring skilled workers from across the UK to an area that otherwise they might have seen as too far away and maybe too remote, too bleak to appeal. Now, Dounreay's heritage officer, James Gunn, has recorded a series of oral history interviews with people who lived and worked around Dounreay. And throughout this talk, I'll be referring to some of those extracts. This one is an extract from his interview with Owen Pugh, describing his first impression of Thurso in 1962 when he arrived. It was dark, it was miserable, and the hotel was less than perfect. What really put me off was I got up about 7 o'clock, as I usually do, dressed, and I was dressed and up in Thurso looking for a place to buy fags and get the morning newspaper. And I found out they didn't have anywhere open at that time of the morning anyway, and in fact the newspapers didn't arrive until 2 in the afternoon. And I thought, if this is civilization, you can stuff it. So that was my introduction to Dounreay. So that was him in 1962. This is his return in 1974. He says, I had a glorious drive up, and I to this day won't forget coming over the Stree, the old road, and that view that looks right down the loch, Queen's View. Absolutely cracking. And the weather carried on, and coming up the coast, Helmsdale was marvellous, and I reached Lathron and brilliant, and I turned over the Causeway Mire and the heavens opened. And it rained and it blew, and I thought, why the hell did I ever leave my nice house down in Liverpool to come to this hellhole? It's just as I left it in 1962. So that was the view of someone, just one person, coming in to Dounreay. So you can see why it was so important that they created this infrastructure and these appealing houses to pull people up and work in this new industry. Because it did seem, for that gentleman there talking about coming from Liverpool, it seemed very far away. It seemed cold and dark and removed. So that was the view of someone coming in. What about the view of someone who saw the area change so substantially from within? Well, this is part of the interview that James Gunn recorded with John Young OBE, who was a long-term councillor in Caithness at the time. So he was asked, could you describe life in Caithness in the 50s, John? And then we'll compare it to the 60s and 70s. I mean, was it totally rural? Fishing, farming, and that was it? And he says, yes, and it was a very different way of life then. It seemed a simple way of life compared to life today. Well, farming seemed to meander along, just fitting into the seasons of the year and so on. It was very relaxed. Of course, I was brought up during the war years, and then when the war ended, there seemed to be so much optimism and the world seemed to be at our feet compared to today where everything seems to be a problem. Life was simple in those days, and the joy of no television and indeed radio only came in about during the war years. We didn't have television until 1959. It was for a year or two before that, but it was pretty poor quality because it was never intended to cover this area. And then we got television in 1959 and, well, things like that changed, and there was no doubt that the coming of Dounreay was a social experiment up here. All those people, many from Wales, the Midlands of England and further south, and some of course from Cumbria where it was already established, they came up here. They made a very useful contribution to the life of Caithness. They mixed in with the people extremely well, whether that was thanks to the councils here and the way they arranged things or not, I don't know, but those people came here. Many of them were just young couples, and I can still remember when Easter came, there was just a deluge to the south because they didn't go away in the Caithness winter, and their people were all in the south and going back. It's strange today to see these people retired and passing away and being buried in Caithness. And he's asked, there are a few generations still up here now, aren't there? Yes, he says, and some came and looked on it as a sentence being taken up here and couldn't get away quick enough. But I noticed they were very quick in coming back again to Caithness. They found it entirely a different way of life. They could let their children out and play at night, and that without any risk compared to the big cities and places further south. Yes, you could leave your car keys in your car and that sort of thing. Yes, insurance mightn't be too happy, but people did that. It was very much a country way of life, even in the towns, and of course the fishing was changing as well at that time. They were getting bigger boats and boats coming from elsewhere and landing, and quite a number of people who had been fishing here went to Dounreay. And he's asked about the changes, that the fact that when Dounreay came in, it was part of a huge change in the working environment anyway. He says that he's asked, farming-wise, were there still horses around or were there tractors coming in? Tractors came in about the beginning of the war, he said, and I think quite a few, seeing the war coming on and knowing that there would be demand for more ploughing up and cropping, bought tractors. And then, of course, tractors with hydraulic lifts and that only came in the later 40s and the 50s. And well, all those machines did away with much of the labour on the farms, and as I say, Dounreay was very welcome. It came at the right time, didn't it? It did, and to employ all those people. And then he's asked about social integration and about how people came up and enjoyed themselves. Was there a them and us attitude, he's asked. No, he says, there was never that. People here benefited, locals as I call them, benefited, because those people who came from the south made it possible for them to have sailing clubs, car clubs, umpteen other clubs like that. We always had rifle shooting clubs in Caithness, but they expanded the membership of that. They contributed a great deal to, well, no, there was never a them and us attitude. They were welcome. It's like so many things. They made themselves at home here, and therefore they were accepted. If they'd come with a grudge, as you might say, then they wouldn't have been so well accepted by the people. And I thought that was a really lovely extract, a really beautifully formed answer about how the coming of Dounreay and that massive influx of people, which could have been something that caused, real disruption, and I'm sure in a way it did, that it was seen as a positive benefit. And that community feeling that he talks about there, that there wasn't a them and us, is echoed in the memories of a gentleman called David Spragg, who travelled from Potter's Bar near London to Dounreay in 1959. And he recalls arriving while the houses were still under construction. He says that they would share their cleaning equipment along from house to house, and that they set up a babysitting circle amongst themselves, which didn't work on payment but on a points system. So you could build up points by babysitting for others and then spend them going out yourself, and someone else would babysit your children. And various other of those oral histories conducted echoed that community feeling. So I've talked a little bit about the fact that this influx of people required this construction of houses. What about the houses themselves? Well, they were built and allocated according to staff grade, but they were deliberately laid out in a mixture. The aim being to avoid separate areas for separate grades. They didn't want there to be the management area and the workers area and whatever else. There was a deliberate aim to mix it and make it feel like a natural community. The first phase of construction started in 1955. 52-storey semi-detached timber houses to accommodate the first cohort of staff who were initially in camps and hostels waiting to go in. And one of those, Arnie Lillyman, who was interviewed decades later, reflected on what a huge achievement that really was, the way that those houses were quickly put up for the workers. He noted that everything depended on the construction companies, Halls and Taws, keeping to a very tight programme, which they did. And he, looking back, says how fortunate he realises they were to get those houses. And he says, hey, you got a new house and you weren't plunged into a housing market which was expensive to say the least. At that time, it was a peak period for people with families. A lot of these young scientifics, there were a lot of young couples often met and working for the authority because there were a lot of females in the scientific classes. A lot of them got married and had been to uni, and then they got a house. It was a good incentive. When they got married, they were able to get a house. It was a good incentive to get married. And then the interviewer says, of course, there was a huge baby boom in the 1960s with all these young couples getting together and all the new schools being built. And Arnie Lillyman says, I've never actually looked at the figures for all that, but you're quite right. For instance, on Swain Road, there were those 3-storey high flats, and they were nice houses too, they were. A lot of them had these young chemists, trainee chemists, they were. There were all sorts, quite a lot of Welshmen among them, and this just all happened. Now, when the building programme was completed in 1963, 1,007 houses had been built. 1,007 houses had been built in those 4 atomic housing estates in Thurso, at Castle Green, Ormley, Pennyland and Mount Vernon. Most were semi-traditional, with prefabricated timber frames and harled brick exteriors. There were also the 4 blocks of flats, as noted in those last set of memories. The street names for these estates were chosen by Dounreay's General Secretary, who was a local man, Donald Carmichael. So he chose the street names and they were approved by the Borough Council. And many of them tied in with Caithness's Norse heritage, so Thorfinn Terrace, Sigurd Road, I mentioned there Swain Road, so designed to tie in with the history and heritage of the area, and incorporating the fact that incorporating the past of the area into something that was so much a part of the future. Now, one of our favourite things at Nucleus, everyone who was allocated an atomic house was issued with a Dounreay Householder's Handbook. And these are amazing. And if you're interested in having a look at them, then have a wee look on the Nucleus Facebook page, because quite often they will post them. There'll be some pictures on there. Now, these householders' books told the new householders everything from how often to sweep their chimney, how to change the tap washers, information on local clubs and societies, churches and schools, things that they would need to know, like plants that would grow in Caithness, how you can plant hedges to act as windbreaks in Caithness, how to get earwigs out of your garden. So all sorts of information. They're fantastic, the householders' handbooks. So that's one aspect of it. All these people coming into work, of course, need houses. But then those people also then need schools and shops and other facilities and infrastructure. So let's start with schools. That large number of people, of families who came to Thurso, inevitably put pressure on the education provision that was already in place. And as soon as Dounreay was selected for the site for the new nuclear facility, talks started about ensuring that there were sufficient educational facilities for the children who would inevitably be bound to come. The Education Committee were advised, you'll like this, the Education Committee were advised that a maximum permanent number of houses would be no higher than 300. And of course we know it was actually over 1,000 that were built. They discussed building a new primary school, extending an existing primary school and building a secondary. And they decided on the last of those. They decided to build a secondary school. It was to have 5 large classrooms, 6 smaller classrooms, 7 specialist large classrooms, a domestic science room, 4 science labs, a woodwork room, a metalwork room, technical drawing room, a library, and a housewifery flat. If any of you had to go to a school where you had to do housewife studies as a course and had to make the bed and so on in a housewifery flat, please do let me know. By 1956, work hadn't even begun, even though the school population was increasing at what was referred to as an alarming extent. There were already fears that it wouldn't be enough, the building that they had planned wouldn't be enough. And advice was sought from Cumberland Education Committee, who had had to deal with a similar situation during the construction of Calder Hall and Sellafield stations. The school construction got underway and it eventually opened in 1958, but by 1959 a new phase of construction began. Now, primary education was also becoming a crisis, with pupils being taught in staff rooms and in a local church hall, with huts and dining rooms being used or being on standby to be used if needed. So this had to be dealt with as well. And eventually Pennyland Primary was opened in 1962, situated right in the middle of the Atomic Housing Estate, followed in 1966 by Mount Pleasant. I've written Mount Pleasant and now I'm thinking, should that be Mount Vernon? Someone will advise which one of those is correct. Now, these schools were desperately needed because before their construction, Miller Academy, which had previously been the only school in Thurso teaching primary and secondary before the high school opened, it had become the largest primary school in Scotland with 1,340 pupils. So you can see, if you remember at the beginning, I mentioned that Thurso's population pre-Dounreay was about 3,000 people. We're now at the point, really only 10 years later, where the primary school population alone, or Miller Academy population alone, is 1,340. So you can see the huge impact this had on the area. In 1959, Thurso Technical College was established to complement Dounreay's in-house training facilities, and today that still exists as part of the University of the Highlands and Islands. So we've had schools and housing. What about shops? What did these people do? All these new people, where did they go shopping? Well, 2 things happened, of course. Existing shops expanded and new ones sprung up as the demand grew. One oral history gives the opinion that in its heyday, Dounreay must have contributed around £50 million to the local economy, and of course shops were a substantial part of that. I wanted to share with you some of the memories that James Gunn, that heritage officer at Dounreay, recorded with Willie Sloss, Jimmy Simpson and David Crowe. Some fantastic memories about the shops. A lot of people that came from all over. I was working with people from other parts of Scotland, Wales, and all over the world, really. They came in from all over. England. You had a good right mix then, and people were happy to make friends because obviously everyone had left their friends in the south. They made the effort to get out and make friends with everybody. Certainly the locals benefited, money-wise and organisation-wise. And they're asked, did Thurso cope with this? Did it expand too quickly? No, I don't think so. I think it coped very well, actually. Lots of things started up and new interests, and as Jimmy says, the shops were rubbing their hands in glee. There was no internet shopping then. What were the new shops, the new hotels? What sprung up? Was the Park Hotel new? The Park Hotel was new. I'll tell you what I found when I came here first, very strange, and that was the licensing laws. The first Christmas, they said, right, we'll go in and we'll have a meal and we'll drink the whole, and that was about all. And the place was shut, and it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, apparently. That surprised me. And they said, strangely enough, then they opened again about 6 o'clock. There were no supermarkets, Willie says. There were no supermarkets. There was the co-op, but that was just small individual co-ops. And they go on to say, yes, a co-op grocery, a co-op butcher shop, a co-op clothes shop and furniture shop, but nothing like Lidl's or Tesco's. And then David Crowe says there were certainly a lot of very little shops, where the arcade travel agents, that was about 3 or 4 little shops. And the TSB used to be next door to that derelict building in St John's Square, but upstairs, just in a small room. So they built a new TSB savings bank where the arcade travel agent is. That used to be 3 tiny shops. There were no pedestrian precinct, all little shops all the way around that corner, like Nobles and that. They did improve Thurso. The shops did expand and they updated. And John Walford added, one thing that surprised my wife arriving as a newcomer was she went into Omans right up here on Trail Street, and Mrs. Omans said, do you want to open an account? So my wife did, and went along to pay the bill at the end of the month for the account. And she was told, oh, we don't do that in Thurso yet. We'll send you a bill at the end of 3 months. That was how it worked then. She was absolutely flabbergasted that she, a newcomer from the far end of beyond, would be trusted for 3 months, build up all her weekly groceries and goodness knows what, with no hint of whether she would or how she would pay. But that's how it was. I just mention it as an example because it wasn't unique. It was a great life. It was the sort of thing that led us to stay. And now, although it was the work that had drawn people initially to Caithness, of course not all their time was spent at work, and social activities sprang up as the shops and the schools did. And from the late 1950s onwards, a whole range of activities were started, many starting in Ormley Lodge. Ormley Lodge served as the UK Atomic Energy Authority's hostel, where single employees were housed along with those who were waiting for their new houses to become ready and their families therefore to come up and join them. And in 1955 they established the Ormley Lodge Club to provide social, cultural and sporting activities for Dounreay employees. The first Ormley Ball was held at the Royal Hotel, Thurso, on the 7th of December 1956, with music by 6-piece Bill Johns Band. 186 people attended the event, which was so formal that apparently many of the women wore their wedding dresses to it. Within 3 years, the Ormley Lodge Club had 500 full and 100 associate members. They had table tennis and badminton, country dancing, cricket, angling, sailing, fencing, photography and film sections, not to mention numerous other parties and events. And Nucleus holds loads of different memories of those who took part in these activities, from those who cycled to Scrabster to go sailing, and those who crammed into the Ormley TV room to watch black and white BBC One, which was the only channel they had until 1964. Many events seem to have circulated around the bar, you'll be amazed to hear, and some beyond closing time. And this anonymous memory made me laugh out loud, and I'm quite sad I'm not doing this live, so I won't get to know if you are laughing out loud as much as I did. But when Valerie sent me this, I was roaring with laughter. Okay, so this is an anonymous memory. Ormley Lodge Club was the place where parties started. If you were a hostel resident and in luck, a member might invite you home to supper after the bar closed, or if not, it was up to one of the rooms to a party. In either case, the essential entrance fee was a carry-out, or at least a contribution to one. Money wasn't plentiful in the old days, and it still amazes me how much fun would spring from a few screw tops and a half bottle. Did half a dozen people really get so merry, note the polite word, on a halfie? During one such party, in an Ormley room, some biscuits had ended up being thrown into a window box. The next morning, the occupier of the room was awakened by what sounded like someone banging on the window. Opening his eyes, he found himself staring into the face of a seagull, which, in trying to snatch the biscuits, had misjudged its bombing run and clattered through the open window. Anyone who has had to deal with a sparrow falling down the living room chimney can only imagine the problems of getting a scorrie out of a single room in Ormley Lodge, especially when your dangly bits are unprotected from beak and claw. For the rest of his days in Ormley, he slept with the window closed. But it was a good party for all that, and it didn't stop many more being arranged as the shutters came down in Ormley Lodge Club. John Laws recorded his memories of Ormley Lodge like this. It was very friendly. I mean, it was a crucible, I suppose. Certainly there were people from all over the UK, Englishmen, Scotsmen, Irishmen, Islanders, Welshmen even, and there were from every part. Not so much from the deep south. In other words, there weren't many Londoners. There were a few Londoners there who I struck up quite long friendships with, but mostly from the Midlands and north of England, the northwest as well. Because of the links of the northwest of England around Risley and the design teams from there and all over Scotland, and about half of them would have been Dounreay workers and the other half contractors. Because PFR was still being built, of course, then everybody got on really well. It was it was our home. So you couldn't have, of course, there were occasional disagreements, even fights, but mostly the atmosphere was really good. Christmas time, we had a big Christmas dinner, which was always a bit riotous, always a good Christmas dinner. It was like I imagined how university halls must have been in a sense, perhaps a bit more rowdy because of the imbalance. There would be like 170 men and 10 women. There were one or two women. In fact, I met my future wife. She moved into the hostel not long after me, actually. We started a relationship within 6 months of me arriving up here. And I remember, because I thought it was a bit daft, we were paying for 2 rooms. And so I went to see Jack Selby, who was then the housing manager, and asked if we could get a flat. And he looked over his glasses at me and informed me that the authority did not cater for informal arrangements. Ormley Lodge membership was only open to those who worked at Dounreay, but the UK Atomic Energy Authority expanded this in 1958 by opening the Dounreay Sports and Social Club at Viewfirth House. By September that year, 1,100 of the 1,600 staff were members. The club put on other activities as well, such as Christmas parties for the children of the Dounreay workers, and apparently in 1960 there were 6 parties catering for 1,140 children. In the 1970s came the Viewfirth folk festivals, and Jenna Mackenzie, who started working in the Dounreay typing pool in May 1961 at the age of 19, recalls the folk festivals. I used to go along to the Thurso Folk Club in the Viewfirth in the 1960s and 70s. It was a busy place, and I saw some great acts such as Billy Connolly, Barbara Dixon and Archie Fisher. I was never much into pop music, but I do recall being very excited at meeting the famous pop group The Hollies at the Dounreay Visitor Centre in July 1964. I had my photograph taken with them, along with George Malcolm, the visits officer. I recently unearthed the photos and the autographs. And I thought, I would finish in all of these memories of people who worked at Dounreay and who saw the influence of Dounreay in the area. I thought I would finish with an extract from another interview of James Gunn's, recorded with Leslie Rowe, a Londoner, which I thought contained a lesson for all of those who move to a new community, perhaps a smaller community. He says, "It was a different world entirely, and of course it was a much closer community. I mean, Dorset's a rural county, but people lived in all sorts of places. There was no one big centre of population. Everyone seemed to live in Thurso. They obviously didn't, but that's where the majority came from. I remember I had to make some presentation to someone that was getting married, and I hadn't realised that I insulted 3 of his relatives in making my little speech. I didn't know who he was related to in the county. Of course, he was related to practically everybody. I don't think I was disparaging, but I realised you had to be very careful and that speaking to you, so-and-so is probably your cousin, probably half a dozen people like that, you know. You have to be very careful what you said. But I think the thing I liked about Caithness above all else was it was very egalitarian. There were no fat cats, and everyone treated everyone else on the same basis." I hope you've enjoyed finding out a little bit more about Dounreay and the huge impact that the nuclear energy industry has had on Caithness over the last few decades. If you're interested in the subject, please do go and have a look at Nucleus's website. They've done a couple of fantastic exhibitions online about the atomic housing and the atomic recreation. And this talk is based on many of the images and extracts that you'll find on there. There's lots of accompanying pictures as well. The nuclear project at Dounreay ran from 1958 until 1994, with work at Dounreay now focusing on decommissioning and environmental restoration. Next week, I hope you can join me again, where we'll be moving into May and the theme of spirituality, faith, and religion. I hope you can join me for the first of those, which will look at the disruption, the creation of the Free Church, and some of the Free Church records that we hold in our archive centres. But for now, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed finding out about Dounreay, and a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. Thank you.